about this. I had many research questions that I was considering. Why, how, and for whom were English translations in the first decades of the 20th century produced? And why was that not done earlier? Particularly if we think about the context of colonialism and World War I, during which British presence in particular solidified throughout the Near East and the Indian subcontinent. Why was it that such towering figures as T.E. Lawrence and Charles Doughty and Wilfred Bell, among others, did not produce English language translations of the Qur'an, despite their considerable expertise in Arabic language and culture, as well as their personal aspirations for literary success? What had to happen to establish the terrain in which translations became needed and marketable? And so, bearing in mind Johanna's insistence upon the importance of genealogy, not just continuity and change, and thinking about Qur'an interpretation as a discursive tradition, how and where do these early 20th century English language translations of the Qur'an claim their place? And so what I would be doing mostly is to try to establish both a context and a pre-context of three of the most important English translations of the Qur'an and its meaning. We've already talked about the complications of that. Specifically those by Muhammad Marmaduke William Pickthall, Muhammad Asad, born Leopold Weiss, and Abdullah Yusuf Ali, and to place their work in historical trajectories of developments that ultimately orientalized the Orientalists. And this is my argument, the Orientalization of the Orientalists, although along three different trajectories. And just a quick word on Muhammad Asad. Why am I including him, since his translation wasn't actually published until 1980? Because the time period that he spent in India and Arabia parallels those of Pickthall and Ali in their own ways. He was in the court of Ibn Saud in Arabia from 1927 to 1932, and then moved to India from 1932 to 1939. He was till 1938. Returned to Berlin to try to rescue some family members, and then when he returned to India, he was actually imprisoned by the British from 1939 until he was released in 1945. So there were a multiplicity of reasons for the delays of the release and completion of his translation, but the ideas behind them began in the same time. So as we're thinking about these English translations of the Qur'an, one thing we should note is that Britain had very long been enamored of the Orient as this place of romance and exoticization and fantasy, focusing first on India and becoming more pointed during the Victorian era, when India was colonized and mapped and thus presumed to be known in a particular way. And then attention shifted to a more vaguely defined and imagined Arabia that I always put in quotation marks because it's not a geopolitical Arabia as we think of today. It was really more of an idea during the Edwardian era that withstood the imperial gaze and remained a blank spot on maps. And really this Arabia became a screen onto which European fantasies could be projected. It was a romantic, magical, faraway world of shifting sands and people that called somehow to the spiritual and the sublime, a world unto itself that ultimately was vastly different from India. This fantasy Arabia became a place for making believe and represented for many British an escape from reality. It was a way of opening vistas for the imagination, heroism, and personal exploits. Arabia's seeming emptiness suggested hidden secrets, inspired poetry. It produced prophets. It encouraged personal transformation for those who wanted to vanish into the desert and immerse themselves in Bedouin life and the landscape at the same time that they really remained separate from it. And so what that portrayal suggests is that the initial attraction of the Orient had been the perception of exoticism and sensual indulgences that could be found there. And that was amplified through its marketing as a mass cultural phenomenon. It's a fantasy that was really born in the cities of Great Britain rather than Damascus or Cairo. The Oriental market took shape through a variety of mass-produced consumer and print goods sold to customers who were eager especially for popular, easy-to-read literature that could be consumed in conjunction with the newly emerging commuter culture at that time on train stations and platforms. And so the older, drier, scholarly, spiritual literature was replaced by a new kind of adventure literature with predictable storylines and certain thematic tropes. Oriental despotism, cultural, religious, occasionally gender cross-dressing, going native, captivity, ethnography, archaeology, and Arab women and sexuality. And I would argue that the change in the market really served as a reflection of the deep changes that were taking place in British culture at the time. The Victorian era had been marked by what we might call social investigation, empiricism, positivism, very much rooted in a Cartesian model of the universe, in which everything was thought to have a mechanical explanation and could be discovered through the use of scientific experimentation and data collection. The Edwardian era, by contrast, regarded that kind of factual certainty with suspicion, experiencing what Weber called the disenchantment of the world. They focused instead on a Bergsonian theory of knowledge that was rooted more in intuitive insight into otherwise inaccessible, concealed essences that required subjective experience in order to really know them, rather than remaining objectively outside the Cartesian style. Edwardians also drew upon other philosophies, such as Bertrand Russell's contention that only sensations, not matter, can be known, suggesting that empiricism creates false impressions of certain knowledge through detachment, rather than the kind of certainty that is rooted in experience. And so within that philosophical construct, the acquisition of knowledge has to move beyond material objects to participation in and perception of the unseen and the unknown. And that helps to explain part of the attraction of Arabia with its vastness and its voids that become even more vital to the quest for certain knowledge. And that helps to fuel this sense of the desire for adventure abroad. I would argue that Victorians and Edwardians shared certain perceptions of the Orient and Arabia, but they were looking to them for different purposes. Victorians were drawn to the sense of the forbidden and the inaccessible, curiosity for the exotic, a desire for sensual indulgence, at the same time that they were also engaged in very serious archaeological studies into the origins and sources of biblical accounts, working to reconcile the presumed truth of the Bible with new geological discoveries about the age of the earth and the introduction of Darwin's theory of evolution. Edwardians, by contrast, seem much more interested in using the inaccessible and the unknown to foster their own escapes from decadence, what they perceive to be the strictures of modern life, class conflict, and the grim realities ultimately of war on the Western Front. They projected themselves into this mirage of medievalism in literature, particularly in Arabia, which was described as the living museum of the Bible. Time was believed to have been suspended. People were presumed to continue to live in the ways that they had during biblical times. And so for both Victorians and Edwardians, mysterious mythical Arabia represented in different ways the discovery of the as yet undiscovered. Ultimately, British perceptions of Arabia were informed by British cultural concerns at the time, not so much what Arabia actually was, but a commitment to a particular epistemological framework for knowing and governing the Middle East. Britain was hungry for heroes, imperial confidence in the British Empire's constructive benevolence, and cultural knowledge of remains of lost civilizations, to the point where the Bible was considered an eternally relevant guide to the region. And even General Allenby made use of the Bible to plan his military strategies, specifically chapter 7 of the book of Judges. He would plan his military strategies based on these biblical accounts. All of that really had more to do with constructing Britain's self-image and its conception of the great game of colonialism than it did with discovering anything actually about Arabia and the people who lived there, all of which remained imagined and imaginary, geographically, cartographically, anthropologically, a country of the mind rather than a place on a map. And so the European ideas and values were played out in this Arabian setting, making it what they wanted and needed it to be, epic and mythic, rather than what it actually was as quotidian. The British were able to craft an image for themselves as imperial for the good of others, rather than domination or material rewards, protecting the freedoms of others, albeit through colonialism, civilizing even where their own society at home failed to be civilized, and offering an umbrella of global salvation and redemption through British Christian values as their true purpose, and in the process ignoring any salvific claims of other traditions. So there is this tinge of the prophetic that was inherent to this particular narrative that framed the mode of epic engagement with the region complete with a full cast of British heroes and one heroine, Gertrude Bell, sold to a public that was hungry for a sense of its own destiny. This is the epic narrative of the British context that preceded the translations of the Qur'an under consideration in this paper. This was a context that yet did not produce its own English translation of the Qur'an during this time, even though it seems that the British public was very hungry for and desired all things Oriental. So why did it not happen during this epic time? And what changed in the context of Pickthall, Ali, and Asad that produced their translations? Why, at a time when we see print culture essentially producing a new group of people, publishers who become gods in their own way in the sense of controlling what is knowable, why would this quest for personal glory and claiming of place in the grand imagined history of Arabia not include something as central and critical as we would think the translation of the Qur'an might be, especially when we think about the Edwardian expectations for the fusion of life and art, and thinking about the production of great literature. Victorian era was rather obsessed with Burton's translation of the Arabian Nights. Edwardian culture focused more on austerity, self-sufficiency, and the security of faith. It's odd that the Qur'an would have escaped such British scrutiny, given overall interest in discovery, preservation, and translation of ancient texts and civilizations, especially those that contain earlier or alternative stories of biblical accounts that had been of so much interest before. And I think it becomes even more striking after 1924, when the caliphate was abolished and the Qur'an alone is left as this sort of unifying symbol for the worldwide Muslim community. It's possible that the desire to discover the undiscovered and access the inaccessible may have rendered something as mundane as the translation of the Qur'an, an already known religious text, not as terribly as exciting. There wasn't anything covert about the Qur'an. It was easily, publicly, readily accessible. You didn't need special spying techniques or disguises or major archaeological discoveries or any sort of intrigue to gain access to this text. It was present in open space. Maybe it wasn't as titillating as other sources or as unique and susceptible to uniquely British discovery. It's also possible that the generation of British agent adventurers just didn't consider the Qur'an to be a worthwhile text. If you read through Lawrence, for example, in the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he oftentimes has a very disparaging view of the Bedouin and Semitic religiosity. That's actually the title of one of his chapters. It's also possible that negative perceptions of Muslims, however defined, created a barrier for the British masses in fairly evaluating the Qur'an. If you think about Victorian and Edwardian perceptions of Muslims, they were fueled by Britain's negative experiences with the Indian Mutiny of 1857, reverses in Afghanistan, continuing problems on the Northwest frontier, General Charles Gordon's murder in Khartoum, projections of the coming end of the Ottoman Empire, we've heard about for decades, and the expansion of the British Empire and missionary activities among both British Christians and Muslims. So in the aftermath of World War I, the Mohammedan question generated some degree of interest in religion, but much of that was rooted in concerns about the potential threat of pan-Islamism, which was, they were very afraid of that in India and elsewhere. And so all of that may have played into reluctance to, or a complete lack of interest in, engaging translations of the Qur'an into English. On the Muslim side of the equation, we've heard about debates about the necessity or prohibition of translations of the Qur'an, and many of these were longstanding. Some looked at it as a tool for possibly gaining converts or encouraging a stronger dedication within the faith. There also remain those who were very concerned about what they perceived to be blasphemous abuse of the divine text. Historically, a canon of exegetical literature have been developed, including opinions and traditions that were established in authoritative works. And so attention to the citation of those works was an important part of the credentialing process for any exegetical work. And that assured that a tradition historically of multivocality was maintained. Early 20th century translation of the Qur'an into English seems to have disrupted that longstanding historical process. Some translators felt less bound to the commentaries and more focused on accessibility of language and conveying ideas to readers who are more interested in meaning, guidance and inspiration than they were necessarily in past scholarly quibbles about minutiae of understandings of particular works. Unlike more traditional scholars who have to write in ways that demonstrate their mastery of the tradition to other experts in order to acquire authority and identity within the tradition, translators are writing to expose new audiences to the material, either in hope of attracting new followers, or at least in the hope of making the tradition or scripture comprehensible to those who are outside of it. Unlike contemporary exegetes who often cite older works without necessarily offering an opinion about them, as a matter of demonstrating their familiarity with the tradition that they hope to expand and become a part of, translator commenters do not necessarily refer to that broader body of tradition, and they may, even in the case of modernists in particular, consider it to be part of their job to insert rationality into the translation. So there are additions of current ideas that are incorporated into these translations. I should note, however, that that influence is not unidirectional. It goes in both directions. Qur'an translators came out of their own particular context in which they shape and are shaped by not only the text, but with the people that they also seek to shape. And so I would argue that translation carries on its own form of an ongoing multi-level discourse. It's just not necessarily the same form that we have seen in the past. Johanna's work on contemporary Muslim Qur'an interpretation calls us to attention to thinking about how religious authority is constructed and what types of quality control exist over interpretation, as we have a variety of powerful status groups, including governments, who control what can and cannot be published and in what format. These earlier translations seem to have largely escaped formal institutional control. They were really more personal endeavors, even as they targeted the general public. And so that perhaps rendered them more susceptible to thinking about how these audiences were going to receive their work, even as that also carried greater potential than for lower quality and limited availability. Earlier translations were also much more dependent upon the perceived authority of the translator, not necessarily the publisher or distributor. And the public's expectation, at least for English-speaking parties, was to associate time spent in the lands where Jesus and Muhammad walked with the legitimacy of that translation. That's a very important part of the story of these translators. So audience expectations, I think, had their own orientalizing impact on what could be produced and consumed. And I think that highlights Johanna's observation that Qur'an interpretations are never value-free. They're always embedded in value systems that prioritize certain themes over others and frame the Quranic text in particular ways. They reflect the context and power dynamics in which they were produced, such that knowing who says something, why, where, who it's directed toward and against, and how and why it is produced, mediated, and received is every bit as important as the content of what is actually said. Consciously or unconsciously, English translations of the Qur'an from the early decades of the 20th century engaged changing understandings of what the Qur'an's purpose was intended to be. Not just a guidebook for the afterlife, it was also understood to have an impact on life here on earth as a source of personal inspiration, as a source of peace, a source of guidance for ethical living, as a means of improving the self and broader society. Here we shift away from discussions about semantics and narrative details and etymology to more of a focus on the true message of the values and how we are supposed to live life. And so the three translators that I was looking at, Pickthall, Asad, and Ali, really had to navigate between these two different worlds. The world of Quranic exegesis and scholarship that assumed that what I'm calling naked encounters with the text were undesirable, and that it could only be understood from within the rich historical tradition. And then we have the world of the audience encountering the text for the first time, largely through the lens of the Christian biblical heritage and therefore expectations related to that. And then we have the added challenge of translation itself. Up until that time, Muslim translations of the Qur'an into English were very scarce. Those that did exist tended to be the product of the two Ahmadiyya movements that were very prominent, with modernist leadings based in India rather than Arabia or Britain. And oftentimes, were produced as a Taoist strategy modeled on the British Bible Society's approach. The goal being to spread Islam into Europe and the United States and to correct the tendentious translations by Christian scholars. So what we have here really is a missionizing of the missionaries that is taking place. The Ahmadiyya used a format that became the standard, presenting the Arabic text alongside the translation. At the same time, those translations were not made by native speakers of English, and this is part of the problem that you were speaking to earlier, that sometimes these translations were really very cumbersome. So they had the advantage of having been engaged by Muslims, but the language that was conveyed was not necessarily appealing to the audiences. And so the three authors in question here highlighted the need for translations that could satisfy both linguistic and confessional concerns, particularly where there was also a desire not to bog the translation down in so much commentary that you would lose the text altogether. So to translate that text in a way that would be satisfactory and comprehensible to the audiences, while also striving to be faithful to the content, form, and meaning of the Quranic text, was really quite a challenge. And that included the risk of producing something other than what the Qur'an was intended to be. Are we dealing with a new product here, or are we dealing with the same old thing? It's a sort of orientalizing of the Oriental for and by the Orientalists that risked, in the end, introducing a sort of imagined Islam, what the translators wanted it to be, rather than necessarily the Islam of historical development. So as we think about comparatively these three translators and their worlds, I would note that they were all products of the same multicultural, cross-pollinated environment of the nexus of Britain, Arabia, and India that constituted the British Empire. One of the most important and often overlooked characteristics of that empire was the mobility of people and ideas in all directions, and their establishment of both missionary and intellectual networks. And so travel to and from Britain, Arabia, and India holds a place in the biography of each one of these translators. Each of them believed in the importance of producing a quality English translation of the Qur'an, but each one had its own approach, rooted not only in personal background, but also their experience of the Orient and the Oriental. All were connected to the British Empire in their own ways. Pickthall by birth, he was a British, he was born in Britain, but then he also sought out Arabia, as he imagined it, throughout the Middle East, and India. Asad was from Europe, but he was from outside of Austria, Poland, and Lviv, which I believe today is in Ukraine, entered into Arabia and India. And Ali was born in India, but then moved to Britain. So very different trajectories for all three of them. All of them had deep connections to Islam, but through different routes. Pickthall was born Christian and converted. Asad was born Jewish and converted, and Ali was born Darudi Bohra and transformed into more of a universalist, who nevertheless adhered to Islam as the ultimate expression of faith. All of them were modernist in outlook, but each one of them chose different themes to emphasize. Pickthall focused on the beauty of the language and pure translation rather than commentary. Asad bridged translation and commentary, but brought a rational approach to the text, and Ali sought to bridge faith traditions as all inherently part of a single universal truth. Of the three, only Pickthall was a native speaker of English. Ali comes a close second because he received education in British schools in India and then moved to Britain. Asad alone learned English as an adult, and then he learned English in India. So we have this sort of Orientalization of the language itself that Asad carried a step further by making English, or working to help make English the official, although not the national language of the nation of Pakistan, that he was very deeply involved in founding. So that takes us back to that question of how colonizing can the language of English be considered then if it becomes the official language of a country where it wasn't necessarily the native language that was spoken. All three of them stepped outside of the traditional parameters for exegetes. Asad and Ali's works are more traditional, and including extensive commentaries. Asad's is much more selective in approach, even as his work is particularly distinguished by his mastery of classical and modern Arabic and his deep study of classical and modern tafsir works in Arabic, although he studied with is not necessarily clear. Pickthall alone included almost no commentary with his translation, but that was because he was trying to provide as close an experience as possible for English-speaking Muslims in their encounter with the Qur'an, who intentionally chose beautiful, majestic, and concise language that would parallel with the pithiness and the poetic nature of the Qur'an's original language. Both Pickthall and Ali wrote in Elizabethan English to try to capture that elevated Arabic of the Qur'an. Pickthall did so to suggest an encounter not only with a lofty deity, but also with a lofty community sharing and upholding connection to the text, to lift people up with their very encounter with the language towards something that was greater than themselves. Ali's use of the language is a little more straightforward and is focused on being intentionally accessible, sometimes scientific, really focusing on the universality of the message through the very language itself, with a desire to meet the community audience wherever they happen to be. Ali's translation was designed in large part for outreach to non-Muslims. Pickthall's translation was designed for internal use of the Muslim community. As he said, the requirements of English Muslims. And Asad fell somewhere in between, described as an ambassador of Islam, a bridge between Islam and the West, as well as between religious communities, serving through his person as a form of living dawah. And maybe Matthew will take issue with me on this, but trying to serve as a form of living dawah, inviting Muslims to find their way back to the moral foundations of Islam while shedding aspects of that accumulated tradition that he decided were no longer relevant, at the same time that he was critiquing Western patterns of thought that he considered to be inappropriate. He did draw upon Abdu's work, but he did so with a much more critical lens toward the failings of the West. And so one of the questions that I want to raise is thinking about dawah. How do we know dawah when we see it? And what exactly does it mean? Does dawah always take on the same form? I think the work of these three scholars challenges us maybe to consider whether translations and commentaries of the Qur'an are necessarily forms of dawah, or perhaps dawah means something else with respect to the times and places in questions here. Was the invitation to accept Islam as one's personal faith? Was it an invitation to discover something of the Qur'an as a literary text or source of spiritual rather than specifically religious inspiration that was tailored through translation to meet the expectations of particular audiences? Or might we even argue in the case of Pickthall that it was an invitation to the community to fully accept him as a Muslim? The story goes that in 1914, he had tried to convert to Islam when he was in Damascus, and for whatever reason, and by whoever these parties were, they didn't really accept that conversion. It was only in 1917 when he made a very public announcement about his conversion to Islam that it was finally accepted. So perhaps this was part of his own credentialing process to prove himself as a veritable Muslim, an argument that I would also make for Assad. So a sort of self-orientalization that takes place for these translators at the same time that I think each one of them had their own particular agenda that they were trying to prove. And so to conclude, very rapidly, I have a much longer version of the paper if anybody's interested. Feel free to email me. I tend to write more than I have time to present because I get caught up in the details, and I was excited about the ideas that I was encountering here. So I invite you to consider in this final question, not only these issues, to what exactly these translations represented and how they fit into this bigger question of dawah, and maybe we have to rethink how we're defining dawah, but also what does it mean to be representative of a new form of British Islam or English speaking Islam, and to consider the impact of India and the Indian environment in all of this, because these texts continue to stand the test of time. They are still widely published, they are widely used, they are available prolifically on the internet, and more likely than not, even though there are newer translations that have been produced, like the Study Qur'an or Muhammad Abdul Hamim's translation of the Qur'an, these three remain very central to the tradition. So I will thank you for your deep attention and we'll shift to questions and answers. Did I do it in 30 minutes?
Yes.